Earlier this month, a group of national experts on gun violence met with local health and community leaders here in Albuquerque to discuss gun violence prevention. One proposal discussed at the meeting was a gun violence restraining order, which allows family members to request that the court issue a temporary suspension of an individual's right to have a gun if that person is in crisis. Our correspondent Gwyneth Dolan sat down with two of those experts to talk about gun policies that they recommend for our state.
Dr. Beth McGinty, assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Josh Horwitz, executive director of the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to go to you first, Josh. New Mexico's firearm death rate is almost 50% higher than the national rate, and the suicide rate with guns is more than 60% higher. Those are pretty alarming statistics. Why are they so high?
Well, I can't tell you exactly why for New Mexico, but I can tell you some of the risk factors that we see nationwide. And some of those have to do with how you look at the prohibitions around gun violence. So in New Mexico and other places where you don't have the types of prohibitions that work, I think that's an important thing. One of those prohibitions is the idea that if you've had a violent misdemeanor in the past, that you should be temporarily prohibited from having guns. If you have a domestic violence conviction, you should be temporarily prohibited from having firearms. But perhaps one of the biggest factors in New Mexico may be just the pure access to firearms. States that have more access to firearms are going to have more suicide death. Those things are correlated pretty closely.
When we think of gun violence, often we think of these mass shootings. We think of the Navy Yard, we think of the high school, the elementary school in Connecticut, and we think these people who commit these crimes, Sandy Hook, they must be crazy. Who would do such a thing? And we think it must be people with mental illness who kill other people with guns. And yet very few of these people actually would be disqualified from owning guns or having them in the first place. Why is that?
Well, I think that's a really good point. And the reality is that mental illness is not is a very small association with interpersonal violence. It's a bigger association with suicide. But when you think about interpersonal violence, mental illness is really not that big a factor. What we need to more focus on is the concept of dangerousness. Take someone like Gerald Loeffner, who shot Gabby Giffords in Tucson. So he may have had some mental illness. But the real issue is that he was exhibiting signs of dangerousness well before the shooting. His parents took his car keys away, took his guns away. The college that he went to, the community college, knew he was dangerous and kicked him out. We shouldn't focus on diagnosis of mental illness. What we should focus on is indicia of dangerousness. And Gerald Loeffner and many of these other shooters had indicia of dangerousness, and that's what we need to focus on if we want to make a dent in interpersonal violence.
Dr. McGinty, how do we find these people who we think are at risk of interpersonal violence with guns? How do we figure out who they are?
The research evidence suggests that there are some pretty clear indicators that we can use. So as Josh just mentioned, commission of a violent misdemeanor crime is a very clear predictor of future risk of violence. Having multiple DUIs or DWIs in a short period of time is also associated with heightened risk of violence in the future. And again, I want to emphasize that in a lot of cases, it's family members who are seeing issues long before somebody comes to the attention of a clinician or law enforcement or anyone else in the community. So we really need a mechanism whereby family members can help get firearms temporarily removed if a person is dangerous, which is where our gun violence restraining order recommendation comes in.
So who would be the one to decide that if someone commits a violent misdemeanor, like what's a violent misdemeanor?
Assault with a deadly weapon.
So if you commit assault and you are arrested or convicted?
Convicted.
So who decides that we're going to go take all your guns away?
Well, it's really for the legislature to make these decisions. In California, the legislature did that a number of years ago, and the evidence is very clear that they've stopped a fair amount of interpersonal violence. And that needs to be done by the legislature. But the ultimate decision, of course, is by the courts. So you empower the courts to make these decisions, and when they find someone and they convict someone of a violent misdemeanor, or in the civil situation find that someone's under protective order, that protective order or that conviction comes with a firearm prohibition. And so that at that point on, you are prohibited from having a firearm.
ever again? I mean, you're convicted of one violent misdemeanor ever, and you can never have a gun ever again?
So that's a great question. The answer is no. Under federal law, if you're convicted of a felony, you're prohibited for life, although there's some restoration. Our recommendations actually, for most of the recommendations we have, are temporarily. So for a violent misdemeanor, it would be 10 years. For multiple DUIs, it would be 5 years. And for the gun violence restraining order, it would be 1 year.
Dr. McGinty, you mentioned DWI earlier. New Mexico, as you probably know, has a very, very high rate of DWI, and we have a big problem with people who are arrested over and over and over again. Are you saying that people who struggle with alcohol and substance abuse can never be trusted with guns?
No. So again, I think this recommendation should be temporary. We know that the risk of violence associated with risky alcohol behavior, which drinking and driving is a prime example. This is a time-limited risk factor. It's often highest in younger people in particular. And alcoholism is, it's a treatable health condition. This is not something that people necessarily are affected by life. So while there is an immediate risk of violence associated with multiple DUIs and DWIs, a firearm restriction should be temporary. As Josh said, we recommended 5 years.
So one of the recommendations that you guys have come up with is also a state law that would prevent people from buying or having guns after a short-term involuntary hospitalization for mental illness. Who decides that you are too mentally ill right now to have a gun?
So the way that this works under federal law is if someone is involuntarily committed to an inpatient hospitalization or to outpatient care now under federal law, the way that that works is a clinician makes the initial determination of an individual appears to be a danger to themselves or others, an immediate danger to themselves or others. So we are going to involuntarily commit them to a hospitalization. In most states, it's 72 hours. They are allowed to have a hearing where a judge says yes or no. I do, in fact, deem that this person is a danger to themselves or other. If the judge deems that that involuntary hospitalization should go on due to danger to self or others, the firearm prohibition goes into effect. So no one is actually saying yes or no firearm. It's simply this person has been involuntarily committed. They are unable under federal law to have a gun. The recommendation that you are mentioning specifically for the short-term involuntary hospitalization is the period in between a clinician deciding yes, this person needs mental health care, they are exhibiting dangerous behavior that could harm themselves or others, and the hearing. And the reason that our group recommended that the firearm prohibition go into effect for this period too is that in a lot of states, individuals don't go on to a full commitment because maybe there isn't a bed for them or a whole other host of reasons, but then there's no firearm prohibition. And that clinical judgment of danger to self or others, we believe the research evidence suggests is sufficient to indicate risk of dangerous. Again, that prohibition would be temporary.
Josh, you mentioned domestic violence and the idea that a restraining order could be issued that involves guns too. You can't have guns because of this violent relationship. But I want to ask you, isn't there potential for abuse there? My ex-husband says I'm crazy, so I lose the gun that I bought to protect myself from him?
Yeah, so there's obviously that's an argument that we've heard many, many times. The reality is, in most places, it's a misdemeanor if you actually false report. Okay, so that's some deterrent in that fact as well. But there's also been a lot of history with this, and many, many states have this. And the reality is that it's not abused. It's something, and the evidence is so clear on this that when abusers are removed from their firearms, the life-saving effects are very, very clinically important and it's an evidence-based finding. So we really think that removing firearms from domestic abusers is one of the key ways to save lives in New Mexico and across the country.
The last thing I want to touch on before we finish up here is suicide again. Dr. McGinty, how is it that we can prevent suicide by looking at guns?
So over half of suicides in the United States, about 51 or 52% in a given year, are committed with firearms. And the vast majority of suicide attempts don't involve firearms, but because firearms are so fatal, we have a disproportionate number of firearm deaths due to suicides in the US, and that rate is climbing. So I think it's critical to think about firearm restrictions in terms of suicide. And what we know is that many of the risk factors that we talk about for interpersonal violence, especially alcohol abuse, are also big risk factors for suicide. So much of what we're suggesting in terms of recommendations for interpersonal violence apply to suicide as well. The other key for suicide is this gun violence restraining order idea. Often family members are the ones who know that someone is in a mental health crisis, which, while mental illness is not very related with interpersonal violence, there's a strong connection with suicide. And so clinicians, family members, they're often the ones who know that someone is potentially at risk of suicide. And having the ability to temporarily remove a firearm until that suicidal crisis could be resolved could have a pretty big effect.
Thank you both for coming and joining us today for this discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.